DICE released episode 5 of their Inside Battlefield podcast today, and I decided for the first time to actually take some notes on interesting bits of information I heard within it, and then comment back at what they're saying from my own player perspective. Today's episode is focused on discussing maps and the map reworks that DICE have been working on essentially since the game launched. The podcast features host and Battlefield 2042 community manager Tom Stratman, joined by, and I'm going to butcher these names, my apologies, Kit Ekloff, the level producer, and Shashank Uchil, the lead level designer. So join me and let's go through and discuss some of the points I heard in this week's Inside Battlefield episode. Before we fully jump in, if you guys enjoy this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. We're going for that first 1,000 subscriber milestone, and every little bit helps. Alrighty, let's jump into what DICE discusses this week. So the first note I took here is even the devs, well, the map devs at least, they prefer Breakthrough over Conquest because they like to know where the enemies are coming from. That's their words. So what does this tell me? This tells me that DICE devs, like the people making the game, even they think that the game doesn't really flow very well and they can't read the game. That's what that sounds like to me. And that's why they play Breakthrough, because it is a little bit more readable because it's a linear style game mode, as opposed to Conquest where it's just chaos, which is, I mean, that's Conquest's like claim to fame, right? But it could still, in my perspective, Conquest could flow a little better than it does. And DICE right here with this comment, they pretty much essentially admit that. Continuing on, DICE likened taking a risk and doing 128 players on larger maps to a musician trying out a new sound, rather than just doing greatest hits all the time. DICE is very aware their risk didn't pay off. They saw via play data that players don't call in LATV4s to traverse the large AF maps, and instead opt to just run or call in a tank on a rooftop is the example they give. So in the early stages of developing the maps for Battlefield 2042, this sounds like on paper and conceptually they just imagined that players would call in LATV4s to go from point to point. And that sounds good, it sounds like what you would do in the real world, but we have to remember that Battlefield is an arcade shooter game, and that's just not what players are going to do. And it took DICE actually implementing giant maps, the largest in Battlefield history, and seeing the play data from players actually getting their hands on these large maps to actually realize that while it sounds good on paper, it just doesn't work in an actual gameplay scenario. They then mentioned that they had significant problems from trying to develop for both Gen 4 and Gen 5 platforms as far as like maps go. And for those that don't know, Gen 4 and Gen 5 platforms, they're referring to like the old gen Xbox and PlayStation versus the newest generation of Xbox and PlayStation. This point right here is not something we can really harp on DICE for. That was more of the, publisher's call on, okay, let's go ahead and release it for both platforms. Players in the community, we've been saying that from the start, really probably shouldn't have been offered on the old gens. And that hamstringed a lot of the development, and we were well aware of it. And I'm sure DICE was aware of it too, but they were told to go ahead and do it because EA wants money. They then go on to say they can't put cover everywhere on maps as large as what they made for Battlefield 2042 because of limitations and the strain that would cause to have all of those assets on the map at the same time. Well, here's an idea. And it's going to be a common theme throughout this podcast. Just don't make the maps that massive to begin with, and a lot of these problems can be somewhat alleviated. The players knew this from day one of launching into the game. At this point, they begin talking about individual new maps they've released. Here are the notes I picked out from those discussions. They start with Exposure. Exposure started off with the same goal as the launch maps: be as big as possible. Exposure was basically already done when they started getting the negative feedback on the launch maps. So at that point, they started to scale it back. They wanted the insane verticality. They mentioned that here in the podcast, which I just don't agree with. I think there's far too much verticality in Battlefield 2042. That's my opinion. DICE's seems to differ. I took down a note here on the discussion. One of the map devs sees the server room on Exposure as fun and a way to farm XP. Ugh. They go on to say they like the last room and in Breakthrough on Exposure. They like the grindy nature of it. They say it's okay. I beg to differ. At this point, we move on to discussing Stranded. They again mentioned big XP farm rooms, so basically the interior of the ship. They're real big on that. They like it. They like that you just get in there and you can farm XP with Irish's APS. There's then a comment where DICE mentions that, in quotes, you could argue that transport vehicles, specifically helis, are too powerful. But, and again in quotes, we've reduced the damage on those. So, I don't think I really need to expand on that comment too much. You need to do it more. You need to do it more. The Super Hind is a flying tank. The grenade launcher is a meme at this point. It's insanely strong. Transport vehicles need to be gutted even more. At this point, the container meme is brought up, and DICE mentions that they have completely embraced the container meme. They have to find cover that's not too expensive, and that's the container. That's why they use it. I can't fault them too much for that here. We needed cover, and since they've mentioned having to use too many assets on the map creates a performance issue, if the container works, I guess we're just going to have to embrace the meme as well. I didn't take any more notes after that until they started talking about Spearhead, so let's jump into that now. They say that Spearhead started differently than it actually ended. They had enough time on this one to go back and adjust this map based on feedback from the launch maps. They say there was a lot of stress, and going back to the drawing board to get this map more aligned with player vision created some issues. There's then a lot of discussion on the difficulty of producing something realistic and grounded out of a completely made-up concept. Using nature and terrain to make cover can be tricky because there's certain ways that topography just doesn't happen naturally, but they would work well for cover. This is what they were keeping in mind when creating Spearhead with all of the negative player feedback on maps in mind. And for the most part, I think they did a good job, at least specifically when it comes to the terrain itself on Spearhead. I think they accomplished their goal in creating something that felt and looked natural, but still provides rises and falls for cover. They then mentioned that the area to the south of Spearhead was initially supposed to be way larger. What they say here makes me think of Provence or like Golmud Railway or Sinai Desert, where the actual map is up north on the map, and then there's just fields down below it that are generally useless for infantry players or general gameplay, period. Later on, they mention that it's not so easy to just rip two flags off of a map that's too large. There's ripple effects to that, which make it not ideal. And this comes back to our theme that I mentioned earlier in the video. Don't start the maps off that flipping large to begin with, and then you don't have that issue. And I think DICE is really learning this. I think they become aware of that sort of in this video, or they have in working on the maps. But like I said earlier, a lot of this could have been avoided if just the conceptual phase of the maps was a lot better and a lot smaller. The final thing I took note of in the discussion about Spearhead is that they like the very minor amount of destruction on the exterior of the cube, where you can destroy the fan and sneak in. Just imagine if they saw the scale of destruction that was present in past battlefields. The next section I took some notes on has to do with Breakthrough. They talk about the Breakthrough game mode. They admit that for launch maps, Breakthrough was not heavily considered in the creation process for the maps. Spearhead was the first map they actually considered Breakthrough more in the development process early on. At this point, I just jotted down a couple of things that are actually in quotes. These are things pretty much verbatim that they said, so I'll just read those off here. We now start with Breakthrough in mind because it's a much more difficult mode to get right. Conquest usually works. This basically infers that they can lay out Conquest however they want, it just works. The goal is every round should end on the last flag in Breakthrough. The game came out, and the maps are like this and like that, and there's not enough cover. We know. We tried our best. It's not easy. We take it to heart. The reworks show we haven't forgotten how to make good battlefield maps. So, a few things to unpack here. Breakthrough used to be largely neglected. That's good to know, since that's my preferred game mode. No wonder it's been garbage to play lately, to the point that I had to make a video about it. I'm glad to hear they were very aware that the launch maps were very poor. They admit that in one of those previous quotes. This is another case where I believe the publisher mandated release schedule, plus the combination of the pandemic and their particular laws regarding going into the studio played a large role. This doesn't necessarily excuse that conceptually the massively large maps were simply not a good idea to begin with. I get wanting to mix it up and not play the greatest hits all the time, like the analogy they used, but that could have been tested with maybe a singular large map, rather than that be the focus of the entire game. One other note I jotted down in this section of the podcast is they say they've never changed Battlefield maps after launch before. This was the first time they've done it. But as Danny on PC pointed out, they actually redid Aerodrome in Battlefield 5, if you guys remember. So just an interesting note, wanted to mention it. The next section of the podcast deals with how they approach reworks for Battlefield 2042. Here's some of the stuff they look at to improve maps. The distance between flags, the traversal time they see in the data, and then the amount of ambush kills or people getting shot in the back that the data shows. Then they look at what can we do to make positive changes happen with regards to those points I just mentioned. Things like cover, etc. When they really began looking at the levels, they decided these levels are too big and there's too much uncovered space between the flags. Maybe there's too many people. I mean, yeah, I'd say 128 players was far too many people, and the downsides way outweigh the positives. So then they asked themselves, do we rework the launch maps? At first they were unsure. They had to pause new map development to actually go back and fix the launch maps. The same team that would rework the levels would be making the new maps, so it's one or the other they had to decide. As we know now, they ended up deciding to rework maps rather than continue to work on the new levels. They fixed Kaleidoscope first because it's a smaller level. They could get that one done faster, and then they could get experience from reworking a map faster. This could help them learn more quickly to make reworking the other maps just a little bit more streamlined. Player experience trumps everything for one of the level designers, he says. As an example, if you want something moody, then music and lighting have to be different. I wanted to mention this point because he's not actually necessarily talking about the experience of the gameplay loop. He's talking about like what you're seeing, what you're feeling, that experience. And that's why I wanted to mention it, because I actually think that for myself, the gameplay loop is probably more important than immersion, so to speak. But he's speaking more to the immersion aspect, which is an interesting note. They then talk about how Breakaway flows much better now that they have shrunk it down from being the largest Battlefield map ever created to something a bit more manageable. They say that it was about the worst received due to its sheer size at launch. I actually find that to be untrue, recalling what I remember people saying at launch. Well, to expand on that, yes, people didn't like the sheer massive size of Breakaway, but each of the pieces or flags of Breakaway played decently well at launch. They were just way too spread out. That was the general consensus for most, if not all, of the maps at launch. There were good parts, but they were so far apart, it was hard to enjoy the map as a whole. As a final note in this section, they say audio has actually been improved on every single map that's been reworked so far. I was actually unaware of this, so interesting little tidbit there. At this point, they talked a little bit about Discarded. I didn't have a lot of notes for this, they didn't say just a whole lot. They compare it to Orbital in that it wasn't the most problematic, but they've added a new capture point. The issue with Discarded is that Breakthrough is a bit snaky. Getting to the ship is challenging, they mention. But they do say they've improved it, and that's about all they said. There's not a lot to go off of here, but it is good to hear because right now Discarded is really a pretty truly terrible experience on Breakthrough at least. But as bad as Discarded is, it's nowhere near as bad as the last map they talk about here, which, you guessed it, is Hourglass. They say this has been the most difficult for them to rework. It was challenging to create to begin with, but now to also rework is proving to be rather difficult. The sand dunes present a bunch of technical issues. Creating cover in dunes in a way that makes sense is difficult, they say. You can't just drop a container in sand dunes and call it a day. Well, yeah, us players know that sand dunes as the key element of a map just conceptually doesn't work for the above-mentioned reasons. It seems like DICE has yet to figure that out. They do say they have a plan now, though. They've been playtesting and prototyping, but it's been difficult. Moving dunes is proving to be technically very difficult. I'm curious to see what they do with Hourglass, I really am, because right now, and probably forever, the launch map version of Hourglass is going to be one of my most hated Battlefield maps. I mean, it's just a barren wasteland of unfunness. The next bit of notes I have here is about the rooftop objectives we all saw at the start of Battlefield 2042. The devs say, on paper, it made sense. In players' hands, it doesn't. This is why this is one of the first things they tackled. They removed it immediately, they claim. The reason they thought it would work is because you can take a chopper up there and just capture it, is basically what they said. They literally didn't think any deeper than that, which is a bit of an indictment of how critically they think about things. Simply taking a chopper up there didn't work for a myriad of reasons, but the two primary ones are everyone was rocking launchers and calling in tanks to sit up there. It just didn't work. Props to them for actually changing it very early on, though. At least they realized the error. It could have been avoided in the first place if they thought a little bit more deeply about it, is all I'm saying. They then say that live players are more creative than they are at DICE. They admit this. So, bring back the community test environment, or the CTE? Could be an idea. At this point, there's a bit of a chuckle between everybody, and they joke that they should have left the hovercraft's ability to scale skyscrapers. It's a feature, not a bug, they say. They are kidding. It's kind of, we look back and laugh at it now, but it is kind of ridiculous. They then switch gears a little bit here, and they say that they learned that balancing and creating maps to account for McKay's grapple gun is tricky. And I mean, I hate to say it, but yeah, duh. Him and Sundance could probably leave the game. They expand on this a bit more and say that the verticality brought about by players being able to reach new spots with the specialists has presented a challenge for map artists and level designers. You can't take little shortcuts here and there and essentially not finish areas that wouldn't have been accessible to players in Battlefields of the past because of the more boots-on-the-ground nature of the games. Now, with grapple guns, etc., you have to make sure everything has textures, collision, etc., so players don't see unfinished areas or get stuck. This in turn is why we may be seeing some of the performance issues and strain that we're seeing with Battlefield 2042, because they can't take some of those little shortcuts that normally wouldn't have been visible like they could in older titles. At this point, they begin to finish up the podcast, and so that about wraps up the points that I had comments for. So what do you guys think about the points mentioned here by some of the lead DICE map designers? Also, what do you guys think about this style of video, commenting on the information DICE is giving us via the podcast? Let me know in the comments below. I hope to see you guys for the next video, and of course, good luck out there on the battlefield.